he will start soon, and then. And good morning. I would like to introduce you Dr. and Professor Parmar. He is our guest this morning. Professor Parmar is Professor of International Politics at the City University of London. He teaches sociology at the London School of Economics and political sociology at the University of London. He is past president, chair, and vice chair of the British International Studies Association and had visiting fellowships in several research institutes at Oxford and Princeton. He is co-editor of the book series Routledge Studies in US Foreign Policy, which is his main research field and the topic of his talk today. Thank you once again, Professor Parmar, for accepting our invitation to be here with us this morning. And please,
Thank you very much, Adriana, and thank you so much for the invitation as well. Any invitation is very, very kindly accepted. It gives a chance for the speaker to have a think about some big, interesting questions in a more systematic and coherent way than is usual. And so it's an honor for me to have prepared or try to prepare a lecture which makes some kind of sense of all the different things which are going on, and also to do it among friends and colleagues from Brazil, some of whom I've got to know quite well in the last year or two, despite the shutdowns and restrictions and pandemics. The Zoom platform has worked very well in that regard, and I see that Professor Felipe Loureiro is on the line here, and I'm very, very grateful to him for suggesting my name for this particular talk as well. And I've learned a great deal from the Brazilian scholars and colleagues that I've come across, and it certainly has broadened the horizons within which I operated in a very Anglo-American centric kind of analysis of American power as well. So I'm very, very grateful to get to know those scholars and their work, and it has some good positive effects on my work. And it's also very nice to address graduate students. I know there are some among the audience today, and I look forward to your questions and comments and observations on my analysis of American power. As I was saying to Adriana just before, I only made up a title for my talk this morning because I was in a state of some confusion about my conclusions and my basic understanding, and with an attempt to try to say something as clearly as possible without prevaricating too much. And in the end, I decided that I am confused and that my title is going to reflect that uncertainty which exists in my own mind, or ambiguity which exists in my own mind. So my lecture talk is entitled Messiness, Instability, and Pragmatic Promise of American Power in Crisis. So I think that reflects a degree of uncertainty, a degree of pessimism, but possibly also some room for some optimism. And I would hope to try to illustrate what I mean by all these things in the course of the next 45 minutes or so. My remarks are structured in 4 parts. Initially, I just want to introduce some conceptual and theoretical approaches that I will be discussing and taking, just a brief sketch. Then I want to provide a kind of broad description of America and its politics in the last 6 months that has brought us to day 100 of the Biden administration. Then I want to look at the political and governmental character of the crisis, and particularly the crisis of the 2 main political parties, which is characteristic of America's challenges at this time. I then want to look at how the United States historically has come to be at this particular point of crisis. And thirdly, I want to look at the directions in which the United States domestically and internationally may be headed and how we may try to make sense of that. And then finally, if we still have the will to live, I will provide some concluding remarks, which might tie up some of what I've said, but it depends to some extent on the time. And then I'm very happy, of course, to take questions from the audience. So to say that the United States and the liberal international order are in crisis is a commonplace. Clearly, there is a loosening or even an unraveling in progress. And that liberal internationalist theory and its practices are under attack from all quarters. Realists are unhappy with the liberal international order. Post-colonial theorists are unhappy, as are Gramscian theorists very clearly as well. And politically, that liberal center, that liberal international order is also heavily criticized from left and right across the world, including within the United States. In that context, a recently published book by John Eikenberry, A World Safe for Democracy, published in mid to late 2020, is very interesting. In that book, John Eikenberry, as you may know, is a scholar at Princeton University, fully acknowledges or perhaps glosses over the critiques which are increasingly loud and made in regard to liberal internationalism. And in a way, he argues for an idea of liberal internationalism, which is a lot bleaker, darker than is normally the case. And he admits in his book that liberal internationalism is mired in a history of empire, of racism, of hierarchy, violence, and hypocrisy. Now, that is quite an admission for someone who, as Perry Anderson has named, the godfather of liberal internationalism. He is one of the leading voices, if not the leading voice, the leading political sociologist, IR theorist, political scientist of the liberal international order and its history, origins, institutions, development, and underlying philosophy. For him to recognize the level of criticism which has come from a variety of critical theories is quite something. And his argument is that that dark view of liberal internationalism has led to, if you like, its internal crisis, that the biggest crisis the liberal international order today faces is not from external forces, but from populist nationalism from within. And for Eikenberry, there are three big dilemmas which he argues that need to be resolved or reconciled or balanced, which go to the heart of the problem of the liberal capitalist democratic internationalism today. And these three questions are particularly salient at this particular moment. The first one, he argues, is how do we reconcile and balance liberty and equality? Secondly, he asks, how do we reconcile and balance individualism and social solidarity or social purpose? And thirdly, he asks, how do we reconcile national sovereignty with interdependence? And if you look at these three questions, these three kind of dilemmas that he argues, each one of them suggests the centrality or the increasing centrality of the state in any way moving forward from where we are in crisis to some kind of post-crisis phase. That is to say that the state, if you like, as a concept, as a set of institutions, as purposive institutions, with a kind of strategy and a role to play in interventionist ways, the state appears to be back after spending many decades, particularly since the Reagan period, in the wilderness, where government, as you recall, Reagan said, government is not the solution. The government, in fact, is the problem that the United States and other countries in the world face. That is to say, there is increasing pragmatic acceptance that the state is back as a central institution in domestic and, of course, in international politics, and it has to play a key role within the resolution of those dilemmas that I've just outlined. So in a way, I think Eikenberry very effectively frames the challenges which are facing the Biden administration today at home and abroad. And what we can see is that this is a much darker, more pragmatic, more realistic picture, perhaps, of liberalism than the usual starry-eyed idealism associated with Woodrow Wilson. Eikenberry's liberal internationalism, then, has become a crisis-ridden version of liberal internationalism, when liberal internationalism is in retreat or on the back foot, but very importantly, but still standing, still resilient, and it's ready for combat. So Eikenberry's is a defense of liberal internationalism, a kind of re-evaluation of it, but also a redefinition of it in order to go forward to kind of address the kind of big fundamental questions of our time. So, and Eikenberry, I would say, is one of those academics in the United States who goes in and out of government. He was in the what was formerly called the Woodrow Wilson School, which is a kind of school which trains people for the state and state service. He has served in the Clinton administration, and he, if you like, is a policy-oriented scholar. He speaks the language which is understood among the think tanks, among policymakers, and so on. And he's also a barometer of the liberal internationalist elite mindset. He's closely associated with the Council on Foreign Relations. He's closely associated with Foreign Affairs, which is their house journal. That is to say that he is in that kind of frame of American academics who step in and out of public service or government service. In that regard, then, he is a perfect barometer of where those liberal internationalist elite mindsets are. And this latest book, A World Safe for Democracy, I think is a very interesting and important expression of that particular mentality at this time. But if you like, just to step away a little bit from the conceptual at the moment, what we can say is that after all is said and done, what can we expect in regard to change of America's global role and its goals in the world as a result of the change of government from Trump to Biden? And I think here I would say, we should expect more change at home in the United States due to the variety of crises with which that country has to face and that president has to face, with pragmatic responses to renew domestic stability, but also importantly, to better compete globally, and to compete globally not only with China, but also with the European Union and any other rival or competitive power that is emerging or may emerge in time to come. But objectively, so we shouldn't expect too much change in its global role and its global goals, that is the maintenance and strengthening of its hegemony. But that hegemony is undermined very severely by domestic instability and weakness, and that will pragmatically create the conditions for a greater level of change at home, even if it doesn't change American foreign policy. But I would say that objectively, there is an opportunity available for major change at home and abroad. There is a possibility, objectively, of a new global grand bargain that better balances the national and the global. And that, unlikely as it may seem, that President Biden could well be, if not the midwife of that change, but certainly someone who could start the process of a conversation about the nature of the change. I would say that he is a pragmatic radical, even an opportunist, with an eye on his legacy, and with too many simultaneous and related crises, which have shown that the old ways just do not work, regardless of your philosophy and worldview, that you have to be pragmatic in the face of what is a very deep legitimacy crisis and a crisis of political instability within the United States. So, having talked a little bit about Eikenberry and the framing of those three dilemmas, I'm going to discuss American power in that context, but I'm also seeking to go beyond that framing and use concepts which are radically at odds with that kind of an analysis, but which, if you like, can map onto the big questions which Eikenberry has so succinctly kind of identified. And that is to use concepts of class and class interests, of the American foreign policy establishment and elite, and of liberal internationalism as an ideology rather than only an academic theory. That is an ideological and political hegemonic project along Gramscian kinds of lines that has helped to build a complex, semi-consensual, Euro-centered system, as well as a hierarchical and violent international system. A consensual system wrapped in a whole system of hierarchy and violence as well, but which features key interdependent elites across the world, particularly within the BRICS, but also other emerging powers. So what I try to do, conceptually, theoretically, is to combine a Gramscian analysis of domestic and international politics with the work of a largely forgotten Marxist from the late 19th and into the early 20th century, Karl Kautsky, his concept of ultra-imperialism, to help understand and explain international order and American power at home and abroad. Ultimately, I agree with Eikenberry on one key point. The current crisis is sourced in the dynamics of liberal internationalism itself, or rather, more descriptively, in the liberal capitalist democratic internationalism, which is what is characteristic of this order. And I would agree with Antonio Gramsci that liberal internationalism and Woodrow Wilson brought the world nearer to an internationalist vision of cooperation, of peace and prosperity, but its own limitations and of its ruling elites and class interests and its interstate rivalries have prevented it from reaching its ultimate goal. So what I would argue is that there are sort of two principal ways in which one could look at the world and from the United States and the United States in this way. One is the kind of liberal internationalist dominant theoretical framing with some of its kind of realist critiques, but there's also another which is much more kind of political sociological, which goes underneath just the political institutions themselves and tries to look at the concepts of class, of transnational elites and transnational historic blocs, and the concept of ultra-imperialism, which is a kind of unification or at least alliances among ruling elites across states, which then effectively have big impacts on the way in which world politics actually operates. What it suggests, if you like, in short, is that although there is a great deal of turbulence in the international system, and there are emerging powers challenging in various ways existing institutions internationally, and there will be turbulence, but I suspect from this perspective, from a Kautskian Gramscian kind of perspective, that this is more like managed competition, managed enmity, rather than some kind of inevitable realist nightmare of an inevitable inter-hegemonic war between the United States and China. Now, I just want to say a few words to try to put a little bit more flesh, very briefly, on this idea of ultra-imperialism and the connection between Kautsky and Gramscian ways of thinking. What I basically am trying to do is to combine Kautsky's concept of ultra-imperialism with a Gramscian understanding of transnational elite networks between strategic elites and states, and that gives us a very interesting way of looking at world politics, which is rather different from the liberal kind of harmonious interdependence or realist interstate anarchy and inevitable violence. What Kautsky argues is that ultra-imperialism is a tendency amongst national ruling elites and classes to form international partnerships in order to jointly exploit the world's natural resources and its peoples, and that eventually leads to significant levels of cooperation alongside competition between capitalist states. And that this intercapitalist kind of state alliances are manifest, if you like, at the business level in cartel style agreements and even in leagues of states. And what some people argue is that the European Union is a very good example of the kind of things that Kautsky in effect was talking about before it came along. And that is a kind of transnational interstate elites collaborating in very deep ways and important ways, which have minimized competition and conflict in a continent which, of course, in which there were two world wars as a result of those interstate and imperial rivalries themselves. And that you can have competition and turbulence alongside these kinds of alliances as well, and that's the character of the world in which we live today. A global level example of ultra-imperialism is the American-led liberal international order itself, as even critics of Kautsky agree that his ideas apply much more to the post-1945 system and the post-1989 system than they perhaps did earlier on. And rivalry within ultra-imperial relations is not uncommon, because allies within states, classes, they develop at different rates. They have, if you like, different levels of productivity, efficiency, and salience, and therefore their power relations are likely to shift. And that then creates flux and negotiation and renegotiation of the elements of the alliances. So we shouldn't expect harmony a la kind of liberal internationalism, but we shouldn't necessarily expect inevitable interhegemonic warfare either. That what we can have is something in between. And in a way, perhaps Joe Biden has summarized it in his own concept in regard to China, which is extreme competition. Competition on a number of levels, but also cooperation at the level of the pandemic and also at the level of climate change, for example, which goes far more deeply than it did, if you like, US-Soviet relations in the proper Cold War. And I will talk about that perhaps a little bit later on. So the significance, I would say, of Kautsky is illustrated in the depth of understanding that ultra-imperialism brings in two key areas of importance: the possibility of war between US and China in the Indo-Pacific, and in the nature of elite power at home and abroad. First, ultra-imperialism makes it clear that despite tensions, war is not inevitable between great powers. The second point is deepened understanding of the alliance between elites who hold shared interests, despite their wealth coming at the expense of their own populations, meaning that transnational elite cooperation is for rather narrow but shared interests, which is then subject to the pitfalls of its unstable domestic foundations. That if you continue to exploit your own people and create greater and greater degrees of inequality, that the resistance to that inequality and the discontent with that inequality and the life chances that are diminished is likely then has to be managed politically. And the management of that politically leads perhaps to two outcomes. One is national populism or populist authoritarianism, and the second is Cold War rhetoric and the identification of an external enemy. But both are performative forms of politics, if you like, which don't actually address the fundamental question of inequalities at home as a result of the political economy and the international political economy, in which there is this transnational alliances, which are actually far more unified with one another than they are actually at loggerheads. So that's the kind of broad frame that I'm putting forward. What I'd like now to do is to go to the second part of what I said I would do, is kind of give a kind of broad description of where America has got to in the last 6 months or so. Because these past 6 months have been, for most American observers of the United States, truly eye-opening. If the previous 3 years weren't already eye-opening, certainly the last 6 months have proved to be quite fundamental in inaugurating developments which I think are powerful in explaining and helping us to understand where the United States, and therefore possibly the world, could be heading. Of course, we know that there is a deeply divided country, with the Republican Party now noted by most scholars of political parties of the United States, and particularly of conservative parties, that the GOP, the grand old party, the Republican Party, one half of the party system in the United States, is actually the biggest threat to American democracy. They contested the election result. They created the conditions for violence during the transition to President Biden's inauguration. And the US now has its fourth consecutive illegitimate president. George W. Bush in 2000 was seen to be illegitimate by so many because of what happened with the voting systems in Florida in particular and the intervention of the Supreme Court. Barack Obama was rejected as even American by a large swathe of the Republican electorate and therefore illegitimate. And now Joseph Biden is considered to be illegitimate by a large section of the Republican electorate. What we have is no agreement even on who is a legitimate president of the United States, and that is a very deep situation of crisis. That violent attempt by the Trump allies and mass supporters to prevent the certification of the election by an insurrectionary threat, an attack on Congress on the 6th of January, in which several people were killed, led to the first time that a president was impeached twice in one term. And we've seen crises of other types which have impacted on the political crisis of a pandemic which has now claimed over 500,000 lives and 32 million cases. We've got congressional investigations into the coup and the insurrection, which has questioned the role of the FBI, of the local police at the Capitol, of the military and the National Guard, as well as the networks of the far and conspiracist white supremacist right. We've had continued massive protests in the wake of George Floyd and the killing of other Black men and women in the United States, as well as against the effects of the pandemic. We have seen strikes and strike movements burst out in larger numbers since for the last 20, 30 years. We've got an emboldened left, an opposition to militarism and military intervention. We've got a number of institutional expressions of that as well. We've also got a president who's won the record number of votes, 81 million, but also with an opponent for an incumbent who won a record number of 74 million votes. And we've got a country which, if you like, is very finely divided in a number of different ways. But Biden has a slim majority in the House of Representatives, a wafer-thin majority in the Senate because of what happened in Georgia in January. He's inaugurated a program of massive state spending, a $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, which has many other measures related to inequality and welfare and so on, as well as green energy and new technologies and cleaner energies and so on, and a massive infrastructure bill of around $3 trillion, which is being planned and discussed at this time. That is to say, we've got probably the largest extension of government spending and government power and state intervention in the economy, probably larger than the Great Society programs of the 60s and possibly approaching maybe something like the New Deal from the 1930s as well. We've also got a relative restoration of multilateralism in American foreign policy. We've seen Biden's administration rejoin the World Health Organization, unsanction the International Criminal Court, rejoin the Paris Climate Accord and the UN Human Rights Council. We've had some movement on the Saudi-Yemen war question and a little bit of movement on the Iran nuclear agreement question and a number of other fronts as well. Yet, we have a country, we have a state, the lead state, the pivotal state in the world. It remains seen as unreliable, unstable, and unpredictable. Because in 2024, the United States could see a return of Donald Trump to the presidency or a Trumpist member of the GOP in the White House. That is, with an ultra-nationalist far-right base. So what we've got is a country which has got a whole range of issues and problems and political crises, which President Biden has been kind of thrust right into the center of. And what I would like now to do is to kind of move a little bit towards looking at the character of the kind of political crisis and the governmental crisis which engulfs the United States today, and try to look at the role of the two main political parties, which I would say are central to the crisis, but also central to any ways out of it which may be available. We don't necessarily have to go through a big catalogue to know that there's a pandemic going on despite the vaccine rollout, which has been very impressive, but which was built on a platform set up by President Trump, but has rolled out much more kind of intensively and extensively in the last 3 months or so, where 200 million people have been vaccinated in the United States. But what we've got, if you like, on top of the economic crisis, of the pandemic crisis, the jobs crisis, and so on, is a far deeper one, and that is a crisis of government itself, or the idea of government, of the whole idea the government or the state really can rival and, in fact, supersede the market or the corporation as the principal ways in which to analyze and assess and strategize on solving this kind of deep legitimacy crisis of the United States, these deep inequality crises of class, of race, of gender, and even of identity, in a situation where we have increasingly powerful armed right-wing groups which launched attacks on state capitals and on the national capital itself, and actually gained entry for the first time ever in American history, and were very close to preventing the certification of a legal election, which was verified as the most secure election in American history. And what I would argue is that the two main political parties are central to where the United States and the character of its crisis today. I'll first very briefly talk about the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is a party of the state and of Wall Street and of the foreign policy establishment. However, its voting constituency includes a very large part of organized labor, as well as working people and minorities. Its voter coalition includes some of the poorest and most oppressed people in the United States, and therefore its messaging must include messaging and some policies which are there to ameliorate and to manage that particular set of constituencies. But if you like, if we see it as a party of the state and a party of the maintenance and consolidation of the state of Wall Street and the overlapping circles of Wall Street and so on with the American state, then what we see is that a very large part of the role of the Democratic Party in American politics is the demobilization and the disorganization of mass protest and mass discontent. And especially via the strategy of identity politics, is to shift mass discontent away from redistributive politics, the politics of redistributing income, wealth, and power, towards redistributing status through identity politics. And that the marginalization of the left is the preferred position of the Democratic National Committee and the mainstream components of the leadership of the Democratic Party. And Biden, if you like, is the perfect reflection in this context of what the Democratic Party is. Biden is 78 years old. Where was he, therefore, during his 20s in the 1960s, when there was the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movements against Vietnam, prisoners' rights, American Indian rights, and so on and so forth? He was nowhere. He is not a politician of street protest. He didn't march with King or any of his supporters like so many young people did in the 1960s. He got 5 deferrals in regard to Vietnam. He didn't protest the Vietnam War. He is not a protest street level politician. He is a politician of the bureaucratic character of the Democratic Party. But he also inherits the pragmatism of the Democratic Party too. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And then we have, of course, the other party, the other half of the American system. Unlike the European systems and so many other countries' systems, where there's a whole array of parties, of which one may be a far-right party, in the United States, there's only 2 viable political parties. One half of that party system is now in the grip of the far right. And that is a very, very significant fact. So that what we've got is 74 million votes for Trump in November. He continues to be the most popular single candidate among Republicans for running in the primaries in 2024. There's a congressional caucus which is just set up called America First Caucus, which is designed to promote Anglo-Saxon values, white supremacy. And there's a new think tank just inaugurated called the America First Research Institute, which, if you like, has got $20 million behind it. And Larry Kudlow, who was the head of the National Economic Council under President Trump, is a kind of leading light within that institution and so on. That is to say, there seems to be an increasing institutionalization of Trumpism and the ideas about America first. That this, if you like, what scholars of conservative politics in the US are calling the biggest single threat to American democracy is now a far-right party. If it was in Europe, it would be on the far right. It would be equivalent of one of the far-right parties in the Netherlands or in France or in Denmark or in Italy or whatever. But it's half of the American political system. So what the United States has got to its institutions itself. And what has been done by the Republican Party, where it is in power in the states since the election, even though a lot of them have said, yes, President Biden won, how they've been behaving is as if the election was stolen. They have been passing voter suppression laws right across the states where they have the power and influence to do so. So that it's harder for people to register to vote. It's harder for people to apply to vote for an absentee or mail-in ballot. There are fewer places, drop boxes, at which to vote in future. And the unequal distribution of the ability to vote in white areas compared with minority areas and poorer areas is more and more stark. They have also been passing more and more anti-protester laws in order to strengthen police powers to stop protest, to send protesters as rioters for longer sentences, and to ban marches and so on. And in effect, what is going on in that second main party of the United States is a strengthening of the positions of coercion and kind of authoritarianism. Then that has continued despite the defeat of Trump at the national election. His power within the party and of his supporters within the party continues to be very, very strong. And that is really effectively where we are in regard to American domestic. And what I would argue is why we should look at American domestic politics when we're looking at America's global role and to understand it is the biggest threat to the way in which the United States is likely to behave in the world comes from the domestic rather than from any existential threat or power challenger in the international system itself. The threat is from within, not from without. And it's an important question to ask next is, how did the United States get to this particular kind of point? And again, I argue that effectively the two main political parties have played a very, very powerful role, particularly since the 1960s. There's been a kind of structural bifurcation between the liberal establishment and the conservative establishment. And that the conservative establishment, which didn't really exist in any real shape or form in the 60s, has now come to occupy a permanent, enduring institutional position within the universities, within think tanks, policy institutions, philanthropic foundations, as well as in many other places. So that what we've got effectively on the landscape within the American establishment as a whole, two very powerful rivaling kind of sets of institutions. And that bifurcation has created separate constituencies, if you like, and which has then added on to the kind of rise of globalization and so on, and the inauguration of Reaganomics and the kind of politics of Thatcherism, etc., has led to greater levels of corporate power and inequality, which has led to, if you like, greater levels of inequality. And in order to kind of meet the discontent, political discontent, which is created by that inequality, a far more coercive state, a far more carceral state, more militarized policing. since at least the mid-1980s, when the inner city area police forces were first transferred Pentagon weaponry in order to fight the war on drugs, and which has since that period has taken off, such that billions of dollars of military equipment has been passed from the military to the police forces in the United States in order to police local populations. And that has led to the greater levels of killing and violence and coercion of local populations. And we can see that in the way in which the number of killings by police has increased to many thousands per annum. But I would argue is that when you get all that, is that the Democratic Party has played a fundamental role in getting the United States to where it was up to the point of Trump, but also sort of beyond that. And that, if you like, it's fundamental to this kind of broad organic crisis, because during the period of Clinton, the neo kind of liberal order, NAFTA, the WTO, the greater levels of globalization, the financialization, the abolition of the Glass-Steagall Act, that whole process, which helped to generate inequality, was promoted in that Clinton period and has carried on. Then the support for the Iraq War, the corporate bailout of 2008 under Obama, the regime change in Libya, the hollowing out of the social state. The Republican and Democratic parties are responsible for that kind of, and also then the post-Cold War period of these military interventions. When you look at a graph of American military interventions from 1945 to 1990, and then you look at from 1990 to 2020, there is a kind of massive upsurge in the number of interventions since 1989 and 1990, even though there were a very large number of interventions in that previous period. So we've had this kind of concept of endless wars. At the same time, there is a pragmatism of the Democratic Party, the thaw with Cuba, the Iran nuclear agreement. And I would argue that Biden is an extraordinarily pragmatic politician. He has no ideology as such. He opposed the Gulf War. He supported the Iraq War. He opposed the intervention in Libya. But on the other hand, as a 78-year-old president, he may well be looking at one term only. And he may be having an eye on his historical legacy and the way in which, what role he can play. And he's been reading the biographies of great presidents, of FDR and others, in order to effectively has inherited all these crises and problems. And he knows that it's not possible just to carry politics on as if these crises weren't happening. And therefore, even the Republican Party under Trump and the Conservative Party in Britain under Boris Johnson have had to shift their strategy towards greater level of state intervention in order to meet the challenges of this crisis. And I think the pragmatic Biden sees an opportunity, if you like, to make a sort of generation level change in the role of the state and to renegotiate the role of the state compared with the individual, renegotiate the link between liberty and equality, and perhaps renegotiate the link between national sovereignty and interdependence as well. So just to kind of go to the third element, I know I'll talk faster because my time's nearly up. I just want to talk about where America may be headed. Like Gramsci, and after him, I do believe in the pessimism of the intellect. We've got to see what's what as clearly and, if you like, as pessimistically and skeptically as possible. But I think we also have to have optimism of the will, that there are also, even in the darkest, bleakest moments, there are often little pinpricks of light, little rays of hope, which could grow and become much more powerful and then suggest ways in which the worst of things could be thwarted, and maybe things have got a sort of a much more brighter kind of a future than there has been. First of all, I would say is that there was a massive rejection of Donald Trump in November 2020, and we shouldn't forget that. It was a massive triumph for American democracy, to get through their election by defeating him with a record number of votes and a kind of massive turnout of voters, but also to survive January the 6th. Those who have been studying that very closely agree that America just squeezed through that crisis. They were very, very close to actually getting into perhaps assassinating or kidnapping or holding hostage a very large part of the American government on that day. And the fact that it didn't succeed was more down to perhaps to sort of chance and luck and so on than it was to any prior planning, because the congressional investigations are showing a massive, they're calling it a failure of communication, but I think skeptics among us are thinking this is far more kind of coordinated than that. But to survive that, to survive the president, the sitting president, challenging in the courts and berating the judges in the courts at different levels, including the Supreme Court, and trying to get the election results overturned in key states, and the fact that the courts stood up to that, the fact that the people who count votes in the local election counties and in the states and who certify elections, including in Georgia, where there was a pro-Trump sort of whole slate, that they withstood that pressure, it suggests that there are deep structures which held together just about. But what would have happened, if you like, if Trump had been more powerful in the Congress and more powerful, even more powerful in the Senate, and the certification process and the pressure would have been so great that one fears what might have happened if the arithmetic of American politics had been different. But nevertheless, they did get through that. And that's where, if you like, what Biden effectively has inherited. And I think this is where his pragmatism is so significant and important. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not an ideologue, nor was Woodrow Wilson, and nor was Lyndon Baines Johnson. But there we've got some of the three kind of key presidents who, if you like, defined a generation of politics which followed them. And I think Biden, if you like, is more of a weather vane than he's a kind of a signpost. And he can quite clearly see that the United States cannot be governed in the old way. It cannot be governed by force alone at home, or perhaps even internationally. And that, in effect, there's a kind of messy, unstable domestic politics and political system. And unless the far right and the Republican Party, which is its head, is dealt with, then the United States is going to have a structural problem of instability and domestic political strife for a generation to come. And here I like his concept of grassroots bipartisanship. He puts forward this idea that you can't, I mean, he continues to speak about reaching across the aisle to Republican senators and so on. But he also talks about grassroots bipartisanship, which is to go over the heads of the political leaders straight to the localities where people are living in poor circumstances, where there's drug addiction and so on and so forth, and suicide rates among farmers and in rural communities, where the Republican voters live, where the broadband is not available, where jobs are few and far between, which have been deindustrialized small towns and so on. He's going over the heads and saying, I'm going to run these programs on a massive scale right across the country, which is going to rebuild the economy and jobs, and thereby, if you like, heal the ruptures within the electorate, which could then have an effect on the politics of the party, rather than try to necessarily collaborate in any thoroughgoing way with a party which does not listen, which is busy preparing for the next election, where they want to exclude even more voters than they had previously done before. So I'd say that there's a messy, unstable domestic politics and polity, but with some pragmatic sort of strategies of Biden's, there are chances that the levels of state intervention will have a positive effect on the politics of the country, and that might become a more force for unifying than it may be as divisive as it was under the Trump administration. And in regard to international politics, of course, we've seen a sort of loosening of unilateralism in the World Health Organization, Paris, and that kind of thing. But at the same time, we've got aggressive rhetoric and strategies being developed in regard to China, which is the kind of principal sort of strategic rival as identified by both main political parties. And if we were, as I do, try to apply the kind of Gramscian, Kautskian viewpoint or approach to the US-China relationship, what that would suggest is we need to look for empirical evidence of what does that transnational sort of alliance between elites of the United States and China and other parts of the world, what does it actually look like? What does it do? And how deep is it? How dense is it? And when we look at that, we uncover a whole range of relationships which are very dense and deeply networked, which have been developing since the late 1970s, and that had a kind of heyday, if you like, up until about the early 2000s, from which point there's become a greater anxiety about China's spectacular growth and the possibilities in 20, 30, 40 years of China being a rival, an effective rival. But what we effectively have is very large levels of interpenetration of financial systems, of investment. So despite 4 years of Donald Trump, America First, and tariff wars, the US Chambers of Commerce and all the main business associations, the main industry sectors, when polled, 77%, 80% have increased their investments in China and have no plans to decouple from the Chinese economy because they're making very large amounts of money. Their beef is that they are finding it hard to compete with locals because they can't navigate the opaque structures and systems of bidding for contracts and working within China and within the Belt and Road Initiative contracts around the world and so on. That is a pragmatic opposition, if you like, or a criticism. It is not a, if you like, a deal breaker. So what I would argue is that when you look at university to university, think tanks to think tanks, firms to firms, as well as institutional links and financial and other linkages, we're not talking about Britain and Germany 1914 with a bit of trade between the two countries. We're talking about economies which are so interlocked and interdependent that should China collapse, the United States and the world would go into a massive tailspin. The US has no interest in the destruction of China, just as it has no interest in the destruction of Russia. They have an interest in the subordination of China and the reduction of China to a subordinate status, such that it is not as powerful a potential hegemon as it may want to be. Although, of course, whether China actually viably wants to be at this time an effective hegemon challenging the United States is a separate question. So what I would argue is that that level of interdependence is so deep, so wide, and so long-lived that the idea that these two states will go to war with one another, I think, is not. It doesn't speak to the kind of evidence. And so this Cold War rhetoric, however, is being dialed up. And I suspect that it's much more for domestic consumption and possibly for disciplining allies than it is actually for as a governor of American strategy itself. That is not to say the US is going to withdraw from East Asia. They don't want to. But I do not believe that they are going to do anything seriously which is going to lead to warfare. That's not to say that when you play a game of that high stakes, that mistakes cannot happen and conflicts can spin out of control. But so there is always that risk. But the US is obviously is willing, and the US and China, I guess, are probably willing to take those risks. So I will stop there because I have gone probably a bit beyond what I promised to go to. But I'm happy to take any questions that you might have at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Parmar. Your talk helped us to understand this messiness of US foreign policy and US politics. And I would like to invite Elisa, our student, who enrolled to make questions to you. Please, Elisa.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity of being here. It was a pleasure to listen to you. And my question is about the domestic issue, because I am studying the conspiracy theories, and you talked about their importance in the populism wave that has been happening in the United States, and we have been feeling it in Brazil as well. And in this matter, that the threat is actually internal, the threat to the international liberal order and this role of the United States in being an hegemonic power. So how can we combat those types of conspiracy theories in American foreign policy? And how can we combat their influence in the domestic vote? Because we have been talking about that issue, that the threat is domestic. So how can we look forward to combat those types of politics that have been influencing the foreign policy internally, I mean domestically, because they are strong and they will continue to grow strong and they will continue to lead to waves of populism. That's it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. When you look at the institutionalization of conspiracy politics, you know, we have Tucker Carlson on Fox News, 10 million viewers, prime time. I mean, a lot of corporations have pulled their advertising from his show. There's hardly any big corporations are willing to do brand damage. After the election and the contested election, quite a number of big businesses and corporations also withdrew funding from some of the Republicans who had contested the election, had been on very voluble on 6th of January. And since, some of those corporations have now gone back, of course, including Toyota. But to some extent, if you like, there is quite a broad range of opposition to the conspiracy theorists and their organizations. They did lose the election, and that's an important defeat for them. But when I was talking about the America First caucus in the Congress, then this America First Policy Research Institute, which is in Virginia at the moment and looking for somewhere in Washington, D.C. to set up, and has $20 million behind it, I don't think we're going to be able to decisively defeat the sources of conspiracy style thinking, because it's now become embedded in key institutions, including new institutions, and is embedded in the one leader of the Republican Party, around whom the majority of the Republican Party is still coalescing. A recent survey by a Republican firm, polling firm, identified 5 tribes amongst Republican voters. 15%, one tribe, was never Trumpers. That leaves 85% of the party who are not fundamentally opposed to Donald Trump, but have tactical differences. But a big chunk of them actually still want Donald Trump to come back. So we have institutionalized in American politics, the politics, it has to be said, the big lie. The politics of the big lie is a part of the party politics of the United States. President Trump is making a comeback on the cable shows in a big way. He may not be bothering us as much on Twitter and Facebook as he was, but he's still there and he's very, very influential. So how can you combat the reach of that message? And I think this is where Biden's pragmatism may actually be the way in which it's done. Conspiracy theories, of course, are not invented in American politics by Donald Trump. You know, we go back to the 1790s and the whole idea of the Illuminati, and then the anti-papism, that the Pope was sending Catholics to America to overtake the United States and to overturn it as a Protestant country, and Freemasons and all this kind of thing. And then in the 1960s, the idea that there's a Jewish conspiracy, a bankers conspiracy, a communist conspiracy, people driving thousands of miles to say that the American government is poisoning Americans' water, drinking water, with fluoride, and that this is part of the whole kind of thing of kind of attacking the American body politic. Conspiracy politics is not new, but now it has new platforms. But I don't think that conspiracy theories have dominated one particular party within American politics in the way it has now. So where Biden's pragmatism may come is that you take the feet of conspiracy theories by having government programs which deliver results to people in everyday life. That you can get a job, you can go to college and not be in great debt, that you do have life chances, that you are going to get some access to healthcare. That is to say, the material conditions may help people deal with the conspiracy theory politics, which is designed, if you like, to divide real Americans from minorities, immigrants, workers, leftists, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and so on. So it's a massive ideological, intellectual struggle, but it's also a political and resource-related struggle. And I think Biden's grassroots bipartisanship, I think that's an interesting thing to kind of look at in a bit more depth. And selling those infrastructure programs, not just passing them in Washington, but going to the communities and showing exactly how these are going to work and what differences they are going to make in everyday life. I think he has the opportunity to do that, and I think he sees himself as a one-term president, possibly. He's been put in the presidency against all odds. You know, he's finished as a politician in 2016, effectively, once Obama left office. He was actually campaigning in Michigan for Republicans, raising money for a Republican candidate in that state, and made $200,000. You know, he has very little. His home state, Delaware, has got 1 million corporations registered in that state because of the leniency of the tax regime which operates there. You know, he's a weather-vane politician. He swings around according to which way the wind blows. The wind is blowing towards the old ways don't work anymore. You can't just sit there and pretend there wasn't an attempted coup and insurrection on the 6th of January. You can't just pretend that the whole world was marching about George Floyd, regardless, and relating to their own, struggles, and asking for defunding the police. And, last week I read an article which said that as a result of the BLM protests about George Floyd and for defunding the police, $1 billion in the United States has been diverted from budgets in cities and states from the police to community programs. Okay, $1 billion isn't a massive amount when you think about the big pot of money the United States has. That's a lot of money, though, in certain areas. And if you look at Newark, New Jersey, where they have been experimenting with different forms of policing, demilitarized policing, they've had quite big effects. In fact, I think in 2020, I don't think anybody there was shot dead by the New York police in many decades of policing. So I think there's that kind of grassroots politics, which has created conditions for Biden's presidency, as well as the big pandemic and the economic after effects, and the fact that the country's on the move. Right wing, left wing, centrists, the delegitimation of the American system is almost complete. The center is kind of just, there isn't a sort of strong center anymore. So the way then to combat these conspiracy theories is through direct recognition that the state is back and it has to be back. The crises are too deep, I think.
Thank you. We have here also Ana Paula. It's another PhD student who wants to make questions to you. Please, Ana.
Thanks, Jenna. And thank you very much, Professor, for the very inspiring talk. I have a question. You mentioned very briefly philanthropic foundations, and you wrote in the past about their role, their historic role on kind of knowledge networks, transnational networks, kind of building. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you think philanthropists, these big philanthropists or foundations that are not democratically elected, and if they have a role in building this kind of international kind of liberal order, or if they don't, and how do you see their role in that? Even, well, what we call the good ones that could be better, if you think about Gates or the Open Society Foundations, and the bad ones like the Koch brothers, etc. So we have both sides there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, well, that's a very wide-ranging question, but I mean, as you know, as you've said, I've been very interested in American philanthropic foundations almost since the day I left my mother's womb. So I could talk about this for days and nights, but I think, of course, I would argue they played a very important role, but they are part of the arsenal or the systems of American power, the soft cultural power, institutional, ideological, intellectual power, deeply institutionalized, but they only play such a big role because they are networked with military, economic, commercial, financial power as well. That is to say, they are part of the power elites and they're not separated from them. Because when you look at their boards and so on, they reflect that broader kind of power elite. And of course, they had the early 20th century, very liberal, progressive, statist, wanted to bring America to a modernized internal domestic governmental system, but also were worried about the scramble for Africa and the imperial powers, the colonial powers, getting every part of the world and America missing out. And the big pots of corporate money went in to manage domestic change and global leadership. So I would argue that they played a very big, important role in building those domestic and international networks, Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and so on. And of course, in my book, Foundations of the American Century, I go on and on about that quite a bit. Now, you talk about Gates, who could be better. Yes, well, if you look at what the Gates Foundation has been doing in regard to protecting patents of pharmaceutical companies which have developed the vaccine, which are preventing its release to countries which have very little money, which have few resources, and where the pandemic is wreaking havoc, then Gates is the champion of corporate protection of corporate patents. He is working within the World Health Organization in order to shift the agenda of that organization towards the protection of patents, even though the World Health Organization's chief said that we ought to make this knowledge available to everyone to resolve this problem, because you can't solve a global problem by just securing yourself. And we saw what happened with India and is happening, the graphic scenes, the terrible tragedies which are unfolding daily, and how the United States initially refused to do anything practical to assist. And I think it's only the pressure, political pressure, which has built up in the past few days, has got them to concede that they will release some kind of aid. And how China also is playing, its own role in offering India assistance, and India kind of being very reticent to accept it, and as a part of this kind of geopolitics and political competition. So I think big pots of money that the Gates and the Rockefellers, the Fords, the Carnegies and the Kochs set up are there for two purposes. One is their personal agendas, but two, also they are part of a reflection of systemic factors as well. They are wealth built on a particular kind of corporate political economy, and that is deployed ideologically, intellectually, and politically in order to further strengthen that political economy too, within which those formations themselves have so much invested. And the little bits they spend on the harshest aspects of globalization, or the harshest aspects of inequality and so on, are largely for the management of discontent. And we can see, and people have plotted this on graphs, that when levels of discontent emerge in protest, mass protest, then the levels of spending from philanthropic foundations, federal government and corporations on ameliorating and developing leadership, which is more moderate for those kind of discontents, tends to rise. And for Black Lives, which is a very opaque organization with a $100 million grant from the Ford Foundation. I think there's many interesting questions to be asked about that relationship. Okay, I will stop there though.
Thank you. Professor Parmar, we have several questions from our students who are watching through YouTube. And I will select one, and before I open the questions for the faculty here that might want to ask you some questions. And the first one is from our student Thais, and she wants to know, on the book mentioned, Eikenberry not only argues that the role of the state is central, but that of the United States is quintessential to the survival of the LIO, which I think is Liberal International Order. To what extent do you agree with that? Also, he argues that the US and its allies must contain China's rise as it represents a threat to the LIO. Would you comment on that as well?
Okay. Right. Well, I think that there's the centrality of the state, I think, is now universally recognized regardless of ideology. You have extreme right-wing governments which are increasing the role of the state because of the crises in which they're engulfed. And we have other more centrist or left of center governments doing the same. So the state has to return, if you like, in order to stabilize relations. So I think Eikenberry is recognizing something which has come to be recognized by most people. When you look at the 2008 financial crisis and the responses to that, which were inadequate, the responses initially among liberal states to the pandemic itself and the economic after effects, I think it's been quite clearly seen that this cannot be managed in any other way other than through state coordination and planning and so on and spending. Now, on the other hand, if the US is central to that international system, and I think it cannot be, I'm not sure that the US is fundamental to that system in its current form, but it's certainly absolutely significant in the future of the liberal international order, just because it's the only state in the world which has comprehensive power and the ability to deploy that power at a time and place largely of its own choosing. Nobody else or no other combination of states comes anywhere close to what the United States can do. No one else has 800 military, air, and naval bases around the world. No one else has the capacity in space, in the air, on the sea, and under the sea, or in cyber. That is to say, the US has comprehensive power. Secondly, the US owns the systems on which we all sit and depend. The financial system, the international payment system, is one of the greatest sources of its power. It can sanction states because it can turn off and on the international payment system. If you're not part of the SWIFT international payment system, you're in big trouble. Iran has found out to its cost, as have many others. So to just eliminate the United States as a central force in the world system is going to be very, very difficult. But on the other hand, what Eikenberry does argue is that some of the problems that the US-led international system has are problems of the success of the US-led liberal international system. That China is where it is today, Brazil to some extent, India, Russia, Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey, other middle-income states, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, many other states, they are where they are today because they are part of that US system. That US-centered system has opened up and it accommodated and integrated those particular kinds of systems. And to some extent, some of the competition is a result of the success of the system, that it can open its doors and integrate more and more of the world into it. Now, of course, some of those are more than just necessarily competitors, but the US then is no longer objectively exactly the same relationship to the rest of the world, economically, financially, and so on, compared with where it was when there was no challenger states. But that situation of the US context changed from the mid-1960s with the rise of West Germany and Japan, Europe in general, to the OPEC states, to the demands from the G77 for the new international economic order in the 1970s, and then, of course, the rise of the BRICS themselves by year 2000. That is to say, that there's been every 15 to 20 years, there's been a massive shift in the context of American power, such that there's greater levels of competition and necessity of renegotiation. So what is really required now is, in a way, an acceptance by the US elites that they are heading towards a probably inevitable multipolarity. But no power goes down willingly. People talk about British decolonization. You read the history of British so-called decolonization in Asia and Africa. They held on as long as they possibly could, using every violent, coercive, torturous means at their disposal for as long as they possibly could. And I don't think the United States is going anywhere soon from those positions. But its objective relations and conditions and the kind of increasing influence and power of the Belt and Road Initiative of China and so on is a big challenge. And the possibility that China may develop an alternative international architecture or a hybrid mixed version of Chinese-led and then something in between, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is run on World Bank and kind of recognized principles. But we're a long way from that. When you look at the chart of American military power and military spending, the US spends more than the next 8 or 10 countries put together, and most of those other countries are their allies. It's Britain and France and so on. It's only China and Russia who are in there, and India. So it's true that China is growing faster than anybody thought. It is likely to become more and more ambitious. It may well develop a kind of global power concept. I suspect it's probably inevitable. It probably will lose or ease its idea about non-interference in other countries' affairs. But we're probably a long way from that. But it could well be that this is a moment in which there needs to be a global conversation led by the United States on a pragmatic basis of kind of recognizing that the world geography and economy has changed, and therefore institutional distribution of power has got to change too. And that if you allow much greater voice to these elites with whom you're already allied, actually, because they're only elites where they are because the US system has enabled them to become where they are. So I think that's the kind of conversation that would be required. And I think, I'm not sure how far John Ikenberry really seriously believes that China is an existential threat to the United States. Certainly it's a challenge to the United States, or it's a competition for it. But I think there is a kind of performative domestic politics, which anybody on the left or the liberals has to play to try to sort of retain a degree of credibility and not lose political support, because China is the preferred enemy of the Republican Party as well. And anybody who's soft on China could well be seen to be soft, therefore on national security, etc., and therefore less electable. So that's where I would stand.
Thank you. Felipe, please, your turn.
Thank you so much, Inderjeet, for joining us. You know that we have here in Brazil what some people call the Trump of the tropics. And you talked about the pragmatism of the Biden administration. But I fear that when it comes to Latin America and Brazil, this pragmatism may be not as good as we would like to have, because we had this week the climate change dialogue that Biden promoted, and Bolsonaro was there, and many people thought that Biden would be much more harsh than he's implementing when it comes to Brazil-U.S. relations. Bolsonaro supported Trump. Bolsonaro supported the coup. Bolsonaro made several, rhetoric narratives against Biden. And even though, we have, despite of that, Biden continued to, pragmatically to have relations with Bolsonaro. And we in Brazil, we have a lot of fears when it comes to the 2022 elections, and Bolsonaro in many aspects seem to mimic and to, try to do the same as Trump did. So my question to you, given this Biden pragmatism, do you think that if Bolsonaro tries something similar to what Trump had done in the United States, the Biden administration would support democracy in the Western Hemisphere, or this pragmatism could be, a kind of a different track for what we go here in Brazil? Thank you so much for your participation here with us.
Right. Well, thank you very much for a very, very difficult and impossible to answer question. I think it's a great question. What would Biden's approach be to a kind of Trump-style Bolsonaro activity in 2022? Maybe, thank you, Felipe. Right. Okay, maybe let's have a look at what President Biden has done in regard to Saudi Arabia, which is a kind of another long-standing ally, key strategic partner in a key region. It was so clear that Khashoggi was killed by decisions made within the regime itself by MBS and so on. It is also clear that there's a groundswell of opposition to the Saudi regime for that, but also in regard to the war in Yemen. And the action that Biden has kind of taken is to be a bit more openly critical, talk about reducing arms sales or preventing arms sales to Saudi Arabia, but has not gotten the full swing that many people would want him to go, which is to really put effective pressure on the regime to get out of Yemen and so on. And I think in a way, he's trodden that middle path. And I suspect that that's what he would probably do with any major ally on which the US depends for its kind of regional strategies as well. That it doesn't want to lose, but it doesn't want to necessarily give full support. And I suspect that a successful Bolsonaro remaining in power despite a defeat would probably bring a lot of critical attention. What that might mean in practice, I'm not sure. If it was considered a coup, then American law says if it's a military coup, then it's illegal, and then the US will not recognize and provide aid to a state of that type. But we also know that in Egypt, when there was the takeover of by the military, it was defined by Barack Obama as not a coup, and therefore American aid continued to flow. So that's what I can kind of think of at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Inderjeet. I have another question from Alessandra, another PhD student from us, concerning American politics. And it says, even though the establishment of the Democratic Party, like Biden, represents this liberal capitalist order and defends the interests of a globalized economy, how do you see the growth of openly leftist sections inside the party, like the DSA? Is there a possibility for a leftist turn in American politics?
There is a leftist turn in American politics. It exists objectively. When you look at YouGov, Gallup, and the surveys they've done of opinion in the United States, particularly among millennials, then 40-45% or more of millennials, that is people aged from around 18, 20 to 35 to 39, that very large and increased proportions of those populations are supportive of what they call socialism. And in one survey, there was even an additional 7% who said they supported communism. Now, I'm not going to debate what people mean by socialism and communism, but that's what they selected when given a choice. In the last 1 year or more, we have also seen massive strike activity a massive decrease in the legitimacy of official trade unions, and the rise of unofficial rank and file kinds of committees amongst workers in UPS and Amazon and elsewhere. And we've also, of course, seen more and more progressive Democratic Party primary winners and elected to the Congress, the Squad, but then the Squad has been added to by the organization that Bernie Sanders set up, the Brand New Congress, and you have Jamal Bowman, Cory Bush, and others in the offing as well, AOC and Rashida Tlaib and others as well. So you do have actually a kind of a growing group of progressives and leftists of the DSA and allied with the DSA within the Democratic Party in Congress and around the country as well. So what you see from the DNC, which is the kind of governing body, is continuous attempts to marginalize the left as candidates and as blocs. So you saw that in the Democratic, in the convention last, whenever it was, July or August, Bernie Sanders got to introduce, I think AOC got to introduce one speaker and Bernie Sanders got, but hardly any other leftist got. But you had Republicans on the Democratic, in the convention. You had Colin Powell, you had John Kasich, and others who were kind of anti-Trump Republicans, but hardly any people on the left. So I think the official institutional line of the Democratic Party is to marginalize left thinking and left candidates getting stronger, but it is to incorporate whatever elements of left thinking and domesticate it within the existing Democratic Party's agenda. So that is to put it in their hands rather than give it into the hands of the people who are the champions of that philosophy itself. That retains a degree of institutional control, and it effectively can be used to domesticate or incorporate the politics of change by, if you like, accommodating it or integrating it. So much as, people say you can deal with your critics better if you have them sitting at the same table as you. So you invite a couple of them in, that gives a bit of a boost to the rest, and then the price of their incorporation is that they are effectively silenced because they are now implicated in everything else that the Democratic administration does. But on the other hand, you look at Nancy Pelosi, she used to call the Green New Deal Green New Dream or something like that, very, disparaging, but now they're all talking about it. The crisis has forced even mainstream pragmatic politicians to have to take up more radical kinds of thinking. So the Green New Deals and things like that have been going for that, 20 years. People have been talking about that. But it has become politically salient, not because of ideological shifts in the mainstream, but because of the depth of the crisis of the mainstream in being unable to carry on saying the same old stuff, doing the same old stuff. And the left has been the champion of that, but I don't think, it could well increase in its strength, taking off from Biden, but that's a difficult question for me at this time to answer in specific terms.
Okay, thank you, Professor Parmar. I think we are running out of time. We have several questions that everyone wants to ask, everything about US foreign policy and what's going on American politics that will mean for the future of the whole world. But I think that we enjoyed a lot and we learned a lot, and it's contributed for our understanding of the Brazilian place in the world and how we will manage our politics from now on. And I know it's a hard task that we asked you to give this talk about the US and everything we want to know about it, but I think you succeed, and we want to thank you. And in the name of the whole IR program, graduate program here at the University of São Paulo. Our colleague faculties are here, and our students also here and at YouTube. And thank you very much for being here with us this morning.
Okay, thank you very much as well. It was a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you very much, Inderjeet, for being here. It was a pleasure. And
You're welcome.
I hope we can keep in touch. I think that
Yeah,
Felipe already.
Yeah, I'm in touch with Felipe already on other programs. We're kind of doing a workshop on populisms across the world, which we're hoping to have in September, where we look at Hungary and Poland and Philippines, Britain, the United States, Brazil, among others. So kind of looking at how they compare, how they differ,